Welcome, Warwick. It's wonderful to have you on the China Report.
Glad to be here.
Thank you. I would just like to make sure that people know that you are Senior Fellow at Beijing Taihe Institute. You are Adjunct Professor at Queensland University of Technology. And you are also the author of China, Trust and Digital Supply Chains, Dynamics of a Zero Trust World. And you have been referred to as one of the most important geopolitical thinkers. I certainly agree with that, and I'm very honored that you have made time for us.
Well, I'm honored by the flattery, and those who say that flattery doesn't work have never been flattered. I'm pleased to be here.
Wonderful. Warwick, Mark Andreessen referred to the release of DeepSeek as a Sputnik moment. And I don't think that is an exaggeration, but I don't believe that people have really unpacked the full implications of it. For example, in business, politics, economics, geoeconomics, etc. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about what you think in this current moment, what the implications of the release of DeepSeek signifies.
Well, let's see how we go. Look, in some ways, I think it's probably a little bit more than a Sputnik moment in that it actually points to a fundamental change in the model of technology development and technology distribution. So the Sputnik moment, in a sense, was a call to arms in a comparable field where the model wasn't that dissimilar. But DeepSeek's release does a little bit more. And of course, it is a wake-up call for those who feel that they've been in a slumber. But I also think that it points towards the possibilities of a challenge to what has been for the last 3 to 4 decades the dominant technology model that has straddled the world. I mean by that, of course, the American big tech model, which has evolved into becoming, for much of the world, the de facto standard of global technology. So what was once American technology became, in effect, global technology. The model, I think we understand, and others speak very eloquently about it in terms of techno-feudalism, is premised on the idea that a small number of organizations, and within that a smaller number of shareholders, are able to dominate the industry and market space, so much so that they are able to garner above average profits. In other words, they become today's rentier, and that is the reference to the feudal dimensions of the economic model. The technology framework has enabled a small number of companies to create closed worlds, ecosystems that they fully control, and of course, on that basis, enable them to leverage every touch point within that technology environment to garner value from the processes that others use those platforms for. And we see the economic consequences of that in things like the growing concentration of share value on the New York Stock Exchange in a handful of technology stocks, for example. We see also the historic dominance of a small number of players in defining the standards to which everyone else must comply. Now, DeepSeek changes all of that. It's not the only thing that has challenged the model, but it's the one that perhaps crystallizes the way that the world can think about a challenge to that model. And it does so on the basis of enabling a foundational technology to be accessible at, in effect, zero cost because it's open source, and by which those who access, download, and install and operate that technology locally to then be able to customize that technology to their own particular requirements. And that is the fundamental change that DeepSeek speaks to.
Yes. I think you may have also seen it, but very recently, a team at UC Berkeley replicated the core technology of DeepSeek for $30. And that speaks to the tremendous possibilities that it can be replicated anywhere. It's anywhere in the third world or in global south, for example.
Look, and it's not just a technology model question. It's a broader question around an economic system. So Western capitalism, as it's evolved over the last, couple of hundred years, has tended towards the development of monopolies, duopolies, and market concentration of power for pretty obvious reasons, because in highly competitive environments, the profit rates are squeezed and enterprises need to find new ways of achieving higher than average rates of profits. These are what we'd call rents. And the technology model is one example of the rentier-dominated economic model of financialized Western capitalism. This transformation that DeepSeek points to really can be encapsulated by the idea that Western monopoly capitalism is one that basically prices people out through confected scarcity versus a model that prices people in through abundance. And in this case, it's the abundance of foundational code, as well as actually the accessibility of the hardware that you need to operate it. So you can actually operate full versions of this model on very low cost infrastructure. And you can operate diluted or lighter versions of the model on devices such as Raspberry Pis that cost no more than $100 or so US dollars. This is transformative because it makes this stuff accessible.
Yes. And that accessibility transforms the nature of labor itself, the way in which labor is used and replicated in a mechanical system. If we think of computers as doing cognitive labor, then what that does is it releases the means of production of cognitive labor, of information, back to the people. So in that sense, it sounds very revolutionary. If I were to take a contrarian perspective, what would you say to somebody who says that, this is a passing moment. It's hype. The moat is significant. Compute is important. Anything that DeepSeek has done, OpenAI and Google can replicate, and they'll simply take what has been released into the commons and re-privatize it. What would you say to somebody who makes that argument?
Well, the moat is deep and wide in many areas, and the whole nature of the open source technology is, of course, that anyone can go and take it and do with it what they want. The issue here, though, is that once it's out in the wild, it's actually pretty hard to put back in the cage. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the global community that supports developments within these open source environments is substantial as well and will only continue to grow. Not only will it grow at, I guess, what you'd loosely call the community level of enthusiasts and individuals, but it grows because China in particular, but not only China, has brought industrial heft to back up the open source ecosystem. And we're seeing that across a number of fields. DeepSeek is just one example of it, but companies like Huawei and others are deeply involved in developing open source repositories and supporting open source protocols from chip designs all the way through to their operating systems. So once open source is out in the wild, it's actually very, very hard to fully privatize. There is, of course, an argument that says there will always be a business case for closed systems. that have other kinds of requirements that only closed systems can provide. And I think that that's a fair point. But it's very hard for closed systems to compete against free. That's the first thing. And it's very, very hard for closed systems to, put the genie back into the bottle. So what we're likely to see, I think, is, of course, a scramble by the proprietary systems to find value models that enable them to cost recover in ways that maximize their own particular strengths, whilst the rest of the world will explore how the open source ecosystem can be harnessed and tailored and deployed to drive ambitions around digital sovereignty and empowering people and communities to reclaim the capacity to turn their intellectual labor into value for themselves and their communities.
Yeah. It's interesting. Sam Altman himself has said that they were on the wrong side of history regarding open source. Now, we don't know if that's, just after the fact rhetoric, because certainly they still seem very, very close. They've also made the accusation that DeepSeek has been stealing OpenAI's outputs. And this is a very curious thing, because one of the transformative developments of DeepSeek R1 is that it shows its chain of thought, reasoning. And that's something that OpenAI didn't do at all. So it seems highly suspect that DeepSeek would have taken that from OpenAI. In fact, if you look at OpenAI's newly revealed chain of thought reasoning, you actually see Chinese characters in it. So I think it kind of suggests that perhaps the pilfering was done in the other direction. But again, how would you respond to these types of allegations that, that the distillation was done on the basis of work that had already been done by OpenAI?
Look, the charge of theft is one that is frequently heard, particularly from the West, whenever it confronts, say, technology development that takes place outside of the West, and particularly in China. So, in that sense, it's a little bit of a ho hum yawn moment. But I think the interesting thing is probably two aspects. The first one is that OpenAI itself, of course, trained its model on the back of a large amount of data from the rest of humanity, and I'm still waiting to be compensated for that. It has done commercial deals with academic publishers where OpenAI and the academic publishers benefit financially, but the academic authors themselves don't. The other point, of course, is that human knowledge over the ages is an additive process. So whatever it is that OpenAI has developed was always on the back of the work of the previous generation of scientists and mathematicians and thinkers working in various domains. And I don't think you will find the team at DeepSeek suggesting that somehow they've developed their particular model and their innovations in a vacuum. In fact, we know that the founder of DeepSeek acknowledges the contributions of work that was actually done in the Soviet Union in the 80s as part of the thinking that led to their own conceptual breakthroughs that then they had to turn into reality. So the idea of theft, I think, when it comes to human knowledge, is always a little bit of a pull, if you will. It's a stretch. And this also goes to this issue of the transformation of a model. And it's a mental model in some ways, a paradigm, because DeepSeek built a business model eventually from its earlier open days, OpenAI, to a proprietary system on the basis that it could somehow secure a protected position on the basis of its knowledge. And I think the lesson to be learned here, and perhaps this is what Altman meant when he talked about being on the wrong side of history is that knowledge is to be shared. It is not to be monopolized. And by sharing knowledge and empowering people to explore how that knowledge can inspire innovation, then hopefully people can find ways to improve the conditions that they find themselves and to improve the conditions in which, the world is at and to which these people care about. Perhaps that's what Altman ultimately meant.
Let's hope so. We'll see. Time will tell. But I think, really the important thing is that we're talking about the intellectual commons and the way that DeepSeek has opened that back out for people. And it essentially, I think it boils down to the fact that you cannot and should not, that you cannot actually enclose the knowledge commons, just as, for example, you cannot enclose language. There are no such things as private languages. They devolve into nonsense. And math itself is a kind of a language. AI is simply a subset of computer science, which is a subset of math. It's applied math. And so it's essentially we're reopening the commons. And in doing so, we are democratizing technology and AI in a way that I think is foundationally important.
Look, it reframes this idea of what constitutes the public good again, and what is in fact a commons resource. And knowledge and ideas really are part of the human commons. Arguably, they're part of nature's commons. And this particular project, and there have been a few others since then, of course, isn't making waves because it's unique per se, but it's making waves because it's put a mirror up to many people across the world about how it is that we've engaged in the world predominantly for the last at least 35, 40 years and probably a little bit longer. But it also shines a torch to the possibilities of human creativity itself to bring something constructive to the public space. And where this goes from here, of course, is always the question, isn't it? But hopefully, by shining a torch on the possibilities and demonstrating that there are very, very few barriers for people now to explore what these tools can enable them to do, many good things will happen. I've no doubt many bad things will too. That's part and parcel of, the human condition. But I also think that many good things will happen.
What are some of the good things that we could envision?
Well, hopefully it will reduce the demands on people's time for menial work, right? Just as we've always hoped to reduce the extent to which people will be subjected to menial and tiring and dangerous manual labour, we will be able to liberate people from the menial work of what is in essence repeat and rinse intellectual or cognitive processes. That will potentially open up the possibilities for people to re-engage with what I think is fundamentally core to the human condition or to the being of being human, and that is our capacity to be creative. And those capacities have been dulled by the fact that we've been trapped in economic systems that have required people to subject themselves to processes that are either physically or cognitively routine in nature. So that's one of the good things. I think from a pure application point of view, KJ, that there's a lot of opportunities for people around the world to harness information in ways that will help them make better decisions and quicker decisions about the circumstances in which they find themselves, and which therefore enables them to take advantage of opportunities, but also to solve what might have been otherwise very difficult problems to solve, whether they are around resource utilization, how to configure teams, how to enable information to actually flow smoothly and freely so that transactions can take place. There's a lot of operational benefits as well, but I'd like to think that, and maybe this is the idealist speaking a little bit, but I'd like to think that it could actually liberate the creative dimensions of the human being.
I think you have, described our work in terms of a spectrum from manual to cognitive and repetitive to non-repetitive. And so perhaps it's a way of saying that we can recover or reclaim the non-repetitive cognitive dimension of work and do it in a creative fashion.
Well, there's a way of thinking about this too. So if you imagine the matrix, a cross with four quadrants, and on one axis was routine, non-routine, or repetitive, non-repetitive, and on the other was cognitive and manual. What we're striving, I think, to get to are the quadrants that are dominated by the non-repetitive or the non-routine, because they are the things or the activities that those quadrants, in a sense, encapsulate, are the things that distinguish human beings from something else. And it's not just a cognitive dimension. We are also embodied beings. So the ability and the opportunity to be non-routinely engaged in embodied activity is an important part of being who we are. We're not just, we might be a little bit more, intellectually oriented and probably a little bit less physically oriented than what perhaps we ought to be. But at the same time, hopefully, we will be able to rediscover those opportunities to be creative embodied beings as well as being creative intellectual beings.
You also link it to the development of multipolarity or the possibilities of multipolarity. Can you explain that a little bit for us?
Yeah, look, I guess at the heart of this idea is this notion of digital Westphalia. But the idea of digital Westphalia draws a little bit from the caricature in that it says something along these lines, that for the past 30 to 40 years, the digital and the informational world has progressively become dominated by the rentier interests of a small group of information capitalists. And those information or technology capitalists have been buttressed by the relationships that they have with the political apparatuses of the state in which they are predominantly domiciled, the United States. So the technology and political linkages have been very, very strong for many decades. And in fact, Silicon Valley would not be what it is today had it not been for the ongoing role of the US government through DARPA and defense procurement to actually make possible what's happened in the Valley today. So that is the counterpoint, if you will. And digital Westphalia is the emergence of a number of things, perhaps not coherently congealed together as a single force, but it's a combination of things with their own dynamics and histories that is creating the possibilities for countries, communities, and individuals to extricate themselves in whole or in part from American technology qua global technology. And the elements of digital Westphalia, of course, include open source technologies. We've discussed that already in this program. It also includes other things such as a commitment to enabling, applicable communities of stakeholders to arrive at their own ways of determining the social truths that will enable their societies and their communities to function effectively. So rather than the idea of a universalist narrative unfolding across the globe, we actually have a much more nuanced way in which communities of interests come together and develop and sustain what you would call their social protocols for the truths that matter to them in the work that they do together. And Digital Westphalia ultimately has, both a liberational dimension in that it allows you to extricate yourself from the strictures of American technologies. But of course, it also brings with it other forms of risks. So we can, in a sense, overcome the barbarism, if you will, of techno-feudalism, potentially. But at the same time, we confront the risks of information fragmentation. We confront the risks of competing truth tribes that ultimately resort to violence to resolve their competition over variations of truth claims. And they are risks that are increasingly evident in societies where social media has, I guess, taken a grip, and where there has been a dissolution of the thick and rich webs of shared truths and common knowledges that in the past bound societies together. And so the risk of Digital Westphalia is actually the tribalism of information silos. And if we want to take advantage of the sovereignty potential of Digital Westphalia, we actually also need to confront the challenges of questions around social truths and common knowledges that make societies actually function.
Yeah. I think what's interesting there when we think of a Digital Westphalia that allows digital sovereignty or information sovereignty is what China has done. I mean, I think China is one of the few countries that actually has digital sovereignty, and therefore it is not subject to the kind of barbarism and subversion that is very often present in countries that don't have their own digital sovereignty. The most recent example that I can think of is South Korea, which is currently being torn apart almost in a civil war because of YouTube and the kind of rumor mongering that is happening in YouTube, which is actually a direct replication of US political tropes. And so I think, both the barbarism and the socialism, the social sovereignty, or the sovereign socialism is also a possibility there.
Well, this brings the question of the public good back into frame, right? Or the commons, because something can only be part of the commons if it has broad-based legitimacy. And unless and until societies at large, through their various institutions and cultural norms, find ways to re-establish these common truths, then it is actually impossible for these groups of people to coexist. And we see the fragmentation that's taking place. And we see that, of course, you've talked about the case of the Republic of Korea. The US case, I think, is stark. And we are seeing, of course, this kind of tribalization in Europe as well, where the political and cultural fissures have been cleaved wide open, and in fact have been rendered so stark that groups of people now exist in information ecosystems that are unrecognizable from the information ecosystems of others existing. And yet they supposedly share a common fate in the communities and countries to which they belong. So we can address technology issues by empowering nations and communities to access tools. But they've also got to focus on addressing the cultural preconditions for common narratives and common truths that they can all subscribe to, that communities can buy into as part of their shared purpose and their shared citizenry. And ultimately, of course, given that we all live on this rock, our shared humanity, right? And we're a long way away from that at the moment.
Yeah. I think the fact that you have a neural network that is capable of absorbing and searching and creating connections between the totality of what is existing, for example, on the internet as discursive knowledge, points to the possibility of some of that convergence, at the same time that there is no guarantee that that convergence will necessarily happen.
Well, I think a great recent example is actually the TikTok refugee example, right, where a whole bunch of convergences and shared experiences became very eye-opening. Now, many people talk about the impact on particularly American citizens engaging with Chinese citizens when they realize that perhaps life in China is not as draconian or as bad as perhaps the dominant narrative had you suggest. But I think it actually had another more important effect, and that was it provoked people to reflect upon their own circumstance again. So rather than become obsessed with whether China is or is not akin to the dominant narrative, it actually provoked a reflection upon why it is that the circumstances for many Americans is at odds with a dream that's been sold. And that's actually, I think, the most significant, but perhaps will take much longer to unfold consequence of this cross-cultural exchange. Because in the end, an American citizen cannot directly influence the life of a Chinese citizen or vice versa. But through this experience, they can affect the way that they think about their own circumstance and connect up with other people who share similar concerns and aspirations, and ultimately rebuild those webs of common truths and common knowledges that actually make a society functional again. It's a long haul because it's been undermined really by 20 years of helter-skelter tribalization, maybe more than that. So rebuilding social fabric, rebuilding common cultures in this febrile environment is a very, very tall order. But it's something that I think most societies are working their way to do that at their own pace and in light of their own constraints and conditions. And hopefully the experience of other countries actually getting on with things and focusing on the things that matter for them and talking about how do we create a shared future as humanity on this planet. Maybe that will inspire people to find those new commonalities again.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think that the task before us is to use what we have in these new technologies to build a web of care or a community of care. I want to... Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
I was thinking that, we can think idealistically, and we can also think of things in the current moment, which are far from idealistic and are very, very polarized. So, jumping around once again, we know that Trump has decided to levy 10% tariffs on China. China is in the process of counter-levying, matching these tariffs tit for tat. They're also doing investigations of U.S. monopoly corporations such as Google. And I think all of this kind of boils back down to the fact that in the current moment, as we move towards multipolarity, there's also a tremendous reactionary movement that seeks to maintain unipolarity and that sees tech as a very important part of its hybrid war, both tech and the economy. And once again, coming back to artificial intelligence, we can look at the origins of artificial intelligence as rooted in the military economy. That is, the early funding was from DARPA. The perceptron was originally a neural network which was designed to assist target recognition and acquisition. And that kind of genealogy of war and those metaphors of war have come down to this current moment. Eric Schmidt sees the U.S. at war with China, and he sees AI as being one of the key technologies that will ensure U.S. Hegemony. So if we look at, the current moment, the current political moment, what are your thoughts about the use of AI as a disruption to that? I think this may once again touch back on the commons. I have referred to DeepSeek as the AK-47 of the artificial intelligence war, in that it gives, the small person a chance to even the odds against a vast technological military machine.
Yeah, one thing we haven't touched on is the networks of information infrastructure that obviously enables a lot of this. And in parallel to the development of American big tech, in terms of the main companies that we usually associate with that in terms of applications and things like that, we actually have also seen over the course of the last 30-odd years the development of a global network of physical infrastructure, from undersea cables through to national networks of poles and wires and fiber optic cables, satellites and other forms of wireless communications infrastructure. We have server farms, we have switching gear, all of which has been historically necessary to enable data to be transported and stored. Now, the vast majority of that infrastructure has been developed and owned by American companies, and most of that infrastructure has flowed through the data centers of Virginia, enabling American authorities to intercede data flows simply on the basis that the data flows are taking place on American territory and therefore subject to American jurisdiction. So part of the struggle, if you will, of being able to transform the possibilities of open source is also to develop an architecture at a hardware level that is also beyond the reach and the capricious reach of individual nation states and individual corporations, which are tied to the hip of individual nation states. And that challenge, I think, is one that continues to unfold. Some of that challenge is being resolved through the development of very low-cost communication systems, whether it's smartphones that are in the order of $100 a smartphone, through to wireless technologies and open source protocols that enable the movement of the kinds of data that most people in communities need to move to go about doing their business. We're also seeing the expansion of satellite networks that are not American, and that will create alternatives as far as the ability to transmit and store information is concerned. So there's quite a lot to unfold yet before digital Westphalia, in a sense, becomes a locked-in reality as opposed to a likely potential possibility. So that's one dimension I think is worth just bearing in mind. The other issue around this current moment is that, and going back to the tariffs question, I guess, as a way into it, is that the United States, I think, is now going through perhaps the third stage of grief. And that is the stage of grief where it begins to negotiate with a new reality. it's grieving the loss of the unipolar moment, and it did that through anger and denial for some time. But now some sections of the United States body politic is beginning to negotiate a new configuration. And we're seeing a lot of confusion as a result of that. We're seeing, in parts, a lashing out and a desire to use this conjuncture of flux to redraw some boundaries, whether it's Greenland or, as I read today, whether it's Gaza, where the United States now expresses an interest in clearing out the Palestinians and owning Gaza. So redrawing some boundaries. But at the same time, there is clearly also a confrontation with other realities, such as the debacle and the defeat on the steppes of Ukraine, where there is no getting out of the reality that NATO and its principal contributor, the United States, has been defeated in a conventional war. And so what's the United States doing now? Well, the United States is trying to figure out how it, turns a sow's ear into a purse or puts some lipstick onto a pig. And it's doing that by not talking about the loss that most sensible observers have now concluded, but it's talking about a demand for access to rare earths as repayment for the contributions made during the war and prior to the war. So the United States is looking to be able to talk about a win, if you will, out of that debacle. The last thing the United States, I think, is doing, and this is probably the most telling thing, is that it is, how should I put this politely? It is remarking its territory. So like a dog, it is now going around to the nearby posts and marking them. And some talk about the reemergence of a new Monroe Doctrine. Others talk about it in terms of the emergence of this idea of spheres of influence. But however we conceptualize it, I think that there is, in practical terms, actually a recognition of defeat, of strategic defeat. And that the implications of all of these elements, I think, remain a little bit unclear. Is this a retreat so as to rearm? Is this a retreat so as to concentrate effort into Asia? What does this look like over the next 2 years to 10 years? I think that remains a bit uncertain. But what is certain now is that the 30-odd years of unipolarity are well and truly behind us. Most people knew that was the case a few years ago. But as I said, the grieving process can take time. And I think the elements of the United States political elite are finally reaching that negotiation phase. But it's not pretty watching all of this at the moment.
It's not pretty, yeah.
It's confused. It's often violent. It involves quite a lot of lashing out. It also involves, in a very perverse kind of way, a victimization of the United States, where in fact the United States is talking about itself as the victim, that the rest of the world has been taking advantage of the United States for all of these years. And none of that, I think, is particularly edifying. And it certainly, I don't think, displays the United States in the best way that it possibly could display itself.
Yes. Well, I think in another way, I think it's revealing its true colors. One of the things that was most striking for me was Marco Rubio's recent interview with Megyn Kelly, where he essentially says that the world is multipolar now. We're in a multipolar world. And that is as much of a profound and epoch-marking statement as Karl Rove's statement when he said, "We are an empire now. We create our own reality." This is a kind of chiastic undoing of that statement.
Well, there's a very interesting interview, actually. And of course, many people have been drawn to that particular passage. But I think that there's two other parts of that interview which are just as important in a sense. One was his description of the narratives that have accompanied the actions taken towards Ukraine, and he described them in essence as lies. The idea that the US and NATO could somehow defeat Russia in Ukraine, that Ukraine could win and Russia could be dismembered. That's actually quite an important part, because that actually goes with an implicit acknowledgement that, at least from a military perspective, that American preponderance is over. So I think that was an important thing. The second thing was, which I thought was just as interesting, and perhaps it's because of where we are, is that a lot of the speech was focused obsessively around China still. So whilst we talked about a multipolar world, in some ways there is still this deep sense that China's rise is at the expense of the Americans. And, kept talking about things like, we can't let it happen at our expense. Well, multipolarity actually doesn't work that way, right? And the implied message, in a sense, in a confusing way, is that whilst conceptually we accept that the world is no longer unipolar, we resent the fact that we aren't the top dog. What that means in practical terms, I think will take a little bit of time to tell. The last thing that I probably should mention here, and this goes to this question of the tariffs in particular, is the role of the United States economy in the world economy, and why I think that the threat of tariffs is no longer as big a stick as it once was. The reality is that as big as the United States economy is, from a global point of view, particularly from a trade point of view, it comprises now about 15%. Only 6 years ago, it was 20%. So in proportionate terms, in relative terms, it is no longer as important an economic system as it once was. And what that means is that access to the American market is no longer the holy grail. In fact, what's interesting is that when you break down this 15%, you actually realize that a little bit over 8%, a little bit over half, is actually with the EU and Japan and South Korea and Australia, so the Western allies, if you will. And a little bit under half is with the rest of the world. So from the rest of the world's point of view, the United States economy contributes 7% to global trade. And you wonder why much of the rest of the world is sort of shrugging its shoulders a little bit when the big stick of tariffs is being wielded again. And the reason is that, one, the US market's not as important as it once was, but secondly, the natural growth that's taken place in the rest of the world will more than adequately compensate for any loss of American markets within 2 to 3 years. So with a little bit of fiscal support and with a little bit of better coordination around market access and payments infrastructure, the transition period, in the event that the United States cuts itself off from the rest of the world with 100% tariffs on bricks, well, the transition will happen quite quickly. It will be disruptive. It will cause some pain. All change brings with it some pain because it involves adjustments and all of that. But it's not one that I think anybody in the rest of the world need to be afraid of anymore.
I think that is very, very true and very, very profound. And I think that this is a good place to end our dialogue. Thank you so much, Warwick.
Absolute pleasure.